The assessment arrived at the Pentagon in the spring of 1979, and Colonel Charlie Beckwith read it with a fury that his staff had learned to recognize as dangerous. The document was stamped with the insignia of the British Special Air Service, the legendary SAS, the unit Beckwith had spent a year training with, the unit he had modeled his entire career around, the unit he considered the finest special operations force in the world. And they were calling his men amateurs. The American unit, designated Delta Force, displays enthusiasm but lacks the fundamental discipline required for special operations work. Personnel are aggressive to the point of recklessness. Command structure is informal to the point of dysfunction. Methods emphasize speed and violence over patience and precision. Beckwith turned the page, his jaw tightening with each sentence. Assessment. Delta Force represents an attempt to replicate SAS capabilities without understanding SAS principles. They have copied our structure, but not our substance. They fight like cowboys, all aggression, no subtlety. Recommend continued advisory relationship, but low confidence in independent, operational capability. The final line was the one that would haunt Beckwith for years. The Americans have created something loud, fast, and undisciplined. It is not the SAS. It is not clear what it is. Beckwith set the document down and stared at the wall of his office at Fort Bragg. He had spent 15 years building toward this moment. He had fought the Army bureaucracy, the Pentagon skeptics, the institutional resistance to anything unconventional. He had created Delta Force from nothing, recruited the finest soldiers he could find, trained them using methods he had learned from the SAS themselves. And the SAS thought he had failed. They were wrong. Catastrophically, arrogantly, historically wrong. Because within a decade, those undisciplined cowboys would execute operations that redefined special warfare. They would develop methods that the SAS would eventually adopt. They would prove that American aggression, properly channeled, could achieve results that British patience could not. But the proof would come at a price. And the rivalry between Delta Force and the SAS would shape special operations doctrine for the next 40 years. To understand how American operators became the force that made their teachers nervous, we have to go back to 1962, when a young American captain first encountered the unit that would change his life. The British methods would impress him first, the British arrogance would infuriate him later, and what emerged from that collision of cultures would terrify enemies that both nations shared. November 1962, Hereford, England. Captain Charlie Beckwith stepped off a military transport at the headquarters of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment and immediately understood that he was in a different world. The base looked nothing like American military installations. No parade grounds, no rigid formations, no visible hierarchy of the kind that defined Army life. Soldiers walked past officers without saluting. Men wore mismatched uniforms, some in standard British kit, others in civilian clothes, a few in combinations that would have earned court-martial at Fort Bragg. Beckwith's first assumption was indiscipline. His second was that he had made a serious mistake requesting this exchange assignment. Then he watched them train. The SAS selection course was unlike anything the American military offered. Candidates were pushed beyond exhaustion, then required to make complex decisions. They marched impossible distances across brutal terrain, the Brecon Beacons in Wales, mountains that broke men as surely as any combat. They navigated with map and compass while carrying loads that exceeded 60 pounds, moving through rain and cold that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Beckwith observed a candidate collapse at kilometer 37 of a 40-mile march. The man was done physically, mentally, completely. An instructor approached him, looked down without expression, and said simply, "Are you withdrawing?" The candidate tried to speak. Nothing came out. "If you're withdrawing, say so. If not, get up and walk." The candidate lay in the mud for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he got up and walked. He finished the march. He passed selection. Beckwith would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The SAS did not motivate through encouragement. They did not build men up with praise. They simply presented challenges and waited to see who refused to quit. The attrition rate was over 90%. 9 out of 10 men who attempted SAS selection failed. The ones who remained were not just physically capable, they were mentally transformed, able to function at high levels while exhausted, injured, and alone. But the real education came after selection, when Beckwith observed how the SAS actually operated. A 4-man patrol preparing for deployment in Borneo spent 3 days planning an operation that would last 6 days. Beckwith watched the process with growing astonishment. They studied terrain models for hours, memorizing every contour, every vegetation change, every potential ambush site. They rehearsed actions on contact until responses were automatic if ambushed from the left. Each man knew exactly where to move, exactly when to fire, exactly how to break contact. They prepared contingencies for contingencies, planning what they would do if their primary plan failed, and what they would do if their backup plan failed, and what they would do if everything failed simultaneously. The patrol leader, a sergeant named Thompson, noticed Beckwith observing and invited him to ask questions. "How long before you're ready to deploy?" Thompson considered the question. "We've been preparing for 3 days. We'll need 2 more, maybe 3. 5 days to plan a 6-day patrol? If we plan it right, we come home alive. If we rush, we come home in bags. Which would you prefer?" Beckwith had no answer. American military culture valued speed, initiative, action. The idea that spending 5 days to prepare for 6 days of operations was somehow optimal contradicted everything he had been trained to believe. But then Thompson showed him something else. "Look at this," the sergeant said, pointing to a map overlay. "This is where the Indonesians have been patrolling. This is where they've made contact with our people. This is where they've set ambushes. You see the pattern?" Beckwith studied the map. He saw nothing. They patrol the ridgelines. Every time. They think it gives them observation advantage, but it makes them predictable. We're going to use the valleys. We're going to move through terrain they don't think is passable. And when we find them, they won't know we're there until it's over. The patrol deployed on schedule. 6 days later, they returned with intelligence that changed the tactical picture in their sector. They had located 3 Indonesian camps, mapped patrol routes, and identified a supply line that airstrikes subsequently destroyed. They had not been detected once. They had not fired a shot. They had accomplished more through patience and preparation than a conventional battalion could have achieved through direct action. This was the SAS philosophy distilled to its essence. Patience was not weakness. Preparation was not cowardice. Taking time to do things right was not slowness. It was professionalism. Beckwith spent a year with the SAS. He went through their training. He deployed with their patrols in Borneo, operating against Indonesian forces in jungle terrain that seemed designed to kill foreigners. He learned their methods, their philosophy, their way of thinking about special operations. He learned to move at 100 meters per hour through vegetation so thick that faster movement was impossible anyway. He learned to read jungle sounds the way a musician reads sheet music, to know when birds fell silent because humans were approaching, to distinguish between animal movement and human movement, to hear the absence of sound that meant danger. He learned to become invisible, not through technology or equipment, but through discipline, through stillness, through the absolute suppression of every impulse that might reveal his presence to an enemy. And he became convinced that the American military needed its own SAS. The United States Army in 1962 had nothing comparable. The Green Berets existed, but they were designed for unconventional warfare training foreign forces, conducting guerrilla operations, operating as advisors. They were excellent at what they did, but they were not direct action specialists. They were not trained for the hostage rescues, precision raids, and surgical strikes that the SAS had pioneered. Beckwith returned to the United States determined to create an American SAS. He wrote proposals that filled binders. He briefed generals who listened politely and filed his recommendations away. He argued, advocated, and pushed against institutional resistance that seemed designed to crush unconventional thinking. For 15 years, nothing happened. The Army bureaucracy did not want a special unit outside normal command structures. Conventional commanders did not want elite soldiers pulled from their formations. The Pentagon did not want to fund capabilities that existing units supposedly provided. Every argument that Beckwith made was met with counter-arguments that sounded reasonable until you examined them closely. The Rangers can do anything Delta Force would do. Special Forces already handles unconventional operations. We don't need to copy the British. American methods are different. Beckwith was passed over for promotion. He was assigned to dead-end positions. He was told, repeatedly, that his ideas were impractical, unnecessary, and unwelcome. He began to wonder if his year with the SAS had ruined him for normal army service. He had seen what was possible. He could not unsee it. And he could not accept that America would never develop the same capability. Then, in 1977, everything changed. German terrorists seized a Lufthansa aircraft and murdered the pilot. Palestinian terrorists took Israeli athletes hostage at the Munich Olympics. A wave of hijackings and hostage situations demonstrated that conventional military forces were inadequate for these new threats. The Pentagon suddenly wanted exactly what Beckwith had been proposing for 15 years. Delta Force was activated on the 19th of November, 1977. Beckwith was given command and told to create, from scratch, a unit capable of hostage rescue, counterterrorism, and direct action operations. He built it on the SAS model. Selection was brutal, modeled directly on SAS methods. Candidates marched impossible distances through the Appalachian Mountains, carrying loads that broke men who thought they were unbreakable. They were pushed past exhaustion, then required to perform complex tasks. They were evaluated on decision-making under pressure, not just physical performance. The attrition rate matched the SAS. Over 90% of candidates failed. But the ones who passed were exactly what Beckwith wanted. Men who would not quit. Men who could function when everything had gone wrong. Men who could be trusted to make the right decision when no one was watching. Training emphasized the skills that SAS operations required. Close quarters combat with accuracy measured in millimeters rather than inches. Explosive entry techniques that could breach any door, any wall, any barrier. Surveillance and intelligence gathering that could identify targets and assess threats before operations began. Beckwith brought SAS instructors to Fort Bragg. He sent his best men to Hereford for advanced training. He maintained constant communication with his British counterparts, seeking advice, sharing lessons, building the relationship he believed would define American special operations. He thought he was creating a copy of the SAS. He did not yet understand that he was creating something different, something that would evolve beyond its origins, something that would eventually surpass its teachers. And the British were not impressed. The SAS advisors who observed Delta training reported back to Hereford with assessments that were professional in tone and devastating in substance. American candidates were too aggressive. They solved problems with violence when subtlety would serve better. They moved too fast, talked too much, imposed themselves on situations rather than reading them. American training emphasized action over patience. Operators were taught to dominate environments, not blend into them. The SAS philosophy of becoming invisible, of gathering information before acting, of patience as a tactical virtue, these concepts seemed alien to the American approach. American command culture was problematic. Officers and enlisted men interacted too casually. Hierarchies were unclear. Decision-making was distributed in ways that seemed chaotic to British observers accustomed to clearer structures. The 1,979 assessment that landed on Beckwith's desk was the culmination of 2 years of British observation. It summarized every concern, every doubt, every cultural difference that separated American methods from British standards. Undisciplined cowboys, they called them. Beckwith was furious, but he was also worried, because in 6 months, Delta Force would face its first real test. And if the British were right, if his men were truly unprepared, people would die. The 24th of April, 1980. Desert 1, Iran. Operation Eagle Claw was supposed to prove Delta Force to the world. American hostages had been held in Tehran for 5 months. President Carter had authorized a rescue mission. Delta would infiltrate the embassy compound, free the hostages, and extract to waiting helicopters. The operation was a catastrophe. Helicopter mechanical failures reduced the available aircraft below mission minimums. A decision was made to abort. During the withdrawal, a helicopter collided with a C-130 transport aircraft. 8 American servicemen died in the resulting explosion. The mission never reached Tehran. Delta Force had failed without firing a shot at the enemy. The SAS response was professionally restrained and privately scathing. British officers who had expressed doubts about American capabilities felt vindicated. The Cowboys had proven exactly what critics predicted: enthusiastic but ultimately ineffective, capable of training but incapable of execution. Documents from the period reveal the depth of British skepticism. One SAS officer wrote in a private assessment, "The Americans have demonstrated that copying structures does not create capability. Delta Force may eventually develop into an effective unit, but the current evidence suggests they are years, perhaps decades, from operational readiness." Another assessment was more direct. Eagle Claw failed because the Americans lacked the patience and precision that special operations require. They wanted to rush to action before the organization was ready. This is characteristic of American military culture and will not change easily. Beckwith was devastated. His career was effectively over. He would retire within 2 years, his vision seemingly proven hollow by the disaster in the Iranian desert. But Delta Force did not die at Desert 1. It transformed. The next 5 years saw a complete reconstruction of American special operations. New command structures were created. Training was intensified. Equipment was improved. Most importantly, the culture evolved. The operators who had survived Eagle Claw understood what had gone wrong. They analyzed every failure, identified every weakness, developed solutions for every problem. They trained with a focus that bordered on obsession, determined that the next mission would not fail. And they maintained their relationship with the SAS, but the nature of that relationship began to shift. American operators continued traveling to Hereford. British instructors continued visiting Bragg. Knowledge flowed in both directions. But increasingly, the Americans were not just learning, they were innovating. The SAS had developed their methods in the jungles of Malaya, the deserts of Oman, the mountains of Yemen. These were environments where patience was essential, where rushing meant death, where the slow approach was the only approach that worked. The Americans were training for different environments: urban terrain, aircraft, ships, structures where speed was not a liability, but an advantage. Situations where 30 seconds of violence could achieve what 30 hours of patience could not. Delta operators developed techniques for explosive entry that were faster and more violent than anything the SAS had created. They trained to clear rooms in seconds, not minutes. They practiced immediate action drills that prioritized overwhelming force over careful reconnaissance. The British watched these developments with skepticism. Speed was dangerous. Violence was unpredictable. The American emphasis on action over patience contradicted everything SAS doctrine taught. But the Americans were developing something new. Not a copy of the SAS. Something different. Something that would prove itself in operations the SAS methods could not address. October 1983, Grenada. Operation Urgent Fury was a chaotic invasion of a small Caribbean island, and Delta Force played a supporting role that history has largely forgotten. But within the special operations community, what happened on Grenada sent shockwaves through both American and British circles. Delta operators assaulted a fortified prison complex to rescue political prisoners. The facility was defended by Cuban military advisors, professional soldiers, not militia. The compound was hardened, the defenses prepared, the element of surprise minimal. SAS doctrine would have called for extensive reconnaissance, careful planning, patient infiltration, a raid that might take days to prepare and hours to execute. Delta hit the compound in 11 minutes. The assault was violent beyond anything SAS doctrine contemplated. Operators breached multiple entry points simultaneously using explosive charges that collapsed defensive positions before defenders could react. They moved through the structure at a pace that SAS observers later described as reckless, clearing rooms before resistance could organize, killing defenders before weapons could be raised. 17 Cuban soldiers died. Over 30 were captured. All political prisoners were recovered alive. Delta casualties: 2 wounded, none killed. An SAS liaison officer who reviewed the after-action reports wrote an assessment that marked the first shift in British thinking. The American approach at Grenada was tactically unsound by our standards. Excessive speed, insufficient reconnaissance, reliance on violence over precision. However, the results cannot be disputed. They achieved their objectives with minimal friendly casualties against a prepared enemy. Perhaps the American methods have merit in specific contexts. Perhaps the American methods have merit. It was the beginning of a reassessment that would take years to complete. December 1989, Panama. Operation Just Cause was the largest American military operation since Vietnam, and Delta Force executed some of its most critical missions. The most famous was the rescue of Kurt Muse, an American citizen imprisoned by the Noriega regime. Muse was held in a prison directly adjacent to Panamanian Defense Forces headquarters, the most heavily defended facility in the country. Any rescue attempt would face immediate response from hundreds of enemy soldiers stationed within meters of the target. SAS doctrine would have considered this mission impossible. The proximity of enemy forces, the lack of withdrawal routes, the certainty of immediate counterattack, everything about the operation violated principles the British had developed over decades. Delta did it anyway. At 12:46 a.m. on the 20th of December 1989, a specially modified helicopter inserted Delta operators directly onto the roof of the prison. Simultaneously, another helicopter inserted a team to the adjacent building to suppress enemy response. The assault team cleared 4 floors of the prison in under 2 minutes. They located Muse, extracted him through a hole blown in an exterior wall, and loaded him onto a helicopter that had been hovering in a firefight the entire time. The helicopter was hit by enemy fire during extraction and crashed in a nearby street. Delta operators secured the crash site, protected Muse, and held their position against waves of Panamanian soldiers until armored reinforcement arrived. Total elapsed time from first shot to Muse secured: 6 minutes. Total Delta casualties: 4 wounded, none killed. Total enemy casualties: classified, but described in after-action reports as substantial. SAS observers who studied the Panama operations produced assessments that showed marked evolution from earlier critiques. The Americans have developed a methodology suited to their operational requirements. Their approach remains more aggressive than SAS doctrine would recommend, but they have refined it into an effective system. Speed and violence, properly applied, can achieve results that patient methods cannot. We may have lessons to learn from their experience. We may have lessons to learn. The student was beginning to teach the teacher. January 1991, Iraq. The Gulf War provided the first opportunity for Delta Force and SAS to operate in the same theater with similar missions. Both units were tasked with locating and destroying Iraqi Scud missile launchers, mobile targets hidden in the vast western desert, capable of hitting Israel and potentially drawing Israeli retaliation that would fracture the coalition. The operations revealed just how far the two approaches had diverged. SAS patrols operated in the classic mode, 4 to 8 man teams, inserted covertly by helicopter, moving slowly across the desert, gathering intelligence, calling in airstrikes when targets were identified. The patience doctrine, the Hereford way. One SAS patrol callsign Bravo 20 was inserted over 100 kilometers behind Iraqi lines, with orders to locate and report Scud activity along the main supply route. The patrol carried equipment for 14 days of operations. They planned to move at night, hide during the day, observe and report without engaging unless absolutely necessary. Everything went wrong almost immediately. The patrol was compromised within 48 hours, spotted by a goat herd who reported their position to Iraqi forces. What followed was a running battle across the desert that lasted for days. The 8-man team was scattered. 3 operators were killed, 4 were captured and tortured. Only 1 escaped to the Syrian border. The SAS attributed the failure to bad luck compromised by a civilian that no amount of training could have prevented. But American observers noted something else. The patrol had been moving slowly, as doctrine required. They had been patient, as doctrine required. And when the situation changed from covert reconnaissance to combat survival, their approach did not adapt fast enough. Delta operated differently. Instead of long-duration covert patrols, they conducted rapid vehicle-mounted raids. Teams of 20 to 30 operators would penetrate Iraqi territory at high speed, using modified vehicles armed with heavy weapons. They did not attempt to hide. They did not move slowly. They overwhelmed whatever they encountered through speed and firepower. A Delta team commander described the philosophy. The SAS way is to be invisible. That works in certain environments. In the Iraqi desert, with that terrain, with those distances, invisible was impossible. So we decided to be fast instead. Hit them before they know you're coming. Kill them before they can respond. Leave before reinforcements arrive. Different environment, different approach. The results supported the approach. Delta teams destroyed more confirmed Scud launchers than any other coalition unit. They engaged Iraqi forces in multiple firefights, not ambushes, but deliberate engagements where they attacked prepared positions because attacking was faster than avoiding. One raid hit an Iraqi early warning site that was providing tracking data for Scud launches. The compound was defended by over 40 soldiers with prepared positions and anti-aircraft weapons. Standard doctrine would have called for airstrikes, patient observation, detailed planning. Delta hit the compound at 0317 hours with 12 operators in 4 vehicles. The assault lasted 11 minutes. 31 Iraqi soldiers were killed. The early warning equipment was destroyed. Delta casualties: 1 operator wounded, none killed. An SAS liaison officer assigned to monitor Delta operations sent an assessment that marked a turning point in British thinking. The American approach is fundamentally different from ours. They accept risks we would not accept. They engage in situations we would avoid. But their results in this theater have been superior to ours. I observed a Delta element execute a raid that our doctrine would have called impossible. They did not fail. They did not take significant casualties. They accomplished their objective and withdrew before Iraqi reaction forces could respond. Their methods would not work in every environment, but in this environment, against this enemy, they are proving more effective than ours. We must study their approach and determine which elements can be adapted to our own operations. We must study their approach. The teachers were learning from the students. An SAS sergeant who worked alongside Delta during the Gulf War described the experience in terms that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The Americans fight differently than we do. It took me time to understand that different does not mean wrong. Their methods would not work in every environment. But in that desert, against that enemy, they were extraordinary. I watched them do things that our doctrine says cannot be done. They did them anyway. There was one moment that changed how I thought about American operators. We were at a forward staging base, planning the next night's operations. An Iraqi Scud launched from somewhere in our sector. The American commander didn't even finish his briefing. He just said, "Mount up," and his entire element was rolling toward the launch site within 6 minutes. No planning, no rehearsal, no careful preparation, just immediate action. They found the launcher. They destroyed it. They were back at the staging base before dawn. When I asked the commander how he had planned the operation, he looked at me like I was speaking another language. "Plan?" he said. "We didn't plan. We just went." That is not how we operate. But watching them, I understood why it works for them. They train for chaos. They expect things to go wrong. They don't need a plan because they have something better: the ability to adapt faster than any enemy can react. The ability to adapt faster than any enemy can react. This was what Delta had developed that the SAS had not. Not better patience, not better preparation, better adaptation. The capacity to change plans, change tactics, change everything in real time without losing effectiveness. The SAS had spent decades perfecting an approach based on preparation and patience. Delta had spent a decade developing an approach based on speed and adaptation. Both worked, but they worked differently. And in the Gulf War, the American approach proved more suited to the environment. October 1993. Mogadishu, the Battle of Mogadishu, later immortalized as Black Hawk Down, was supposed to be a routine mission. Delta operators and Army Rangers would capture lieutenants of the Somali warlord, Mohammed Farah aided. Intelligence indicated the targets were meeting in a building near the Baqarah market. The operation was expected to last 30 minutes. It lasted 18 hours. The plan was classic Delta: fast insertion, overwhelming force, immediate extraction. Helicopters would deliver operators directly to the target building. Ground vehicles would arrive simultaneously to load prisoners and provide extraction. The assault force would be in and out before Somali militia could organize effective response. At 1,542 hours, the operation launched exactly as planned. Delta operators fast roped onto the target building and adjacent streets. Within minutes, they had secured the objectives and captured 24 Somali prisoners, including 2 of AD's key lieutenants. Then everything fell apart. A Black Hawk helicopter was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade and crashed in a narrow street over a kilometer from the target. A second helicopter was hit while attempting to provide cover and crashed several blocks away. Thousands of Somali militia converged on the crash sites from every direction. The mission transformed from raid to survival. Delta snipers Sergeant First Class Randy Schuhart and Master Sergeant Gary Gordon were orbiting in a helicopter when the second Black Hawk went down. They could see that the pilot was alive, but the ground force could not reach him. Somali militia were converging from every direction. They requested permission to insert at the crash site. Their request was denied. The situation was too dangerous. They requested again. Denied again. They requested a third time. This time, permission was granted. The two operators fast roped into a street surrounded by hundreds of hostile fighters. They fought their way to the crash site, pulled the pilot from the wreckage, and established a defensive perimeter. They held that perimeter against continuous assault until their ammunition was exhausted. Both were killed. The pilot survived. Schuhart and Gordon were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first awarded since the Vietnam War. Their actions embodied everything Delta Force had become. Immediate action in impossible circumstances. Absolute commitment to mission and comrades. The willingness to die rather than abandon someone who needed them. But the heroism was not limited to two men. When helicopters were shot down and American forces found themselves surrounded by thousands of hostile militia, Delta operators fought through the night against overwhelming numbers. They navigated hostile streets, treated wounded under fire, protected crash sites, and refused to leave fallen comrades regardless of the cost. A team leader whose vehicle was disabled organized his men into a defensive position in a narrow alley. They held against repeated assaults for over 6 hours. When ammunition ran low, they collected weapons from dead Somalis and kept fighting with captured AK-47s. A Delta medic treated 17 wounded men while under continuous fire, performing procedures that would have been difficult in a hospital while bullets cracked past his head. He was wounded twice himself and continued working until every casualty had been stabilized. A sniper team on a rooftop held off militia attempting to overrun a ranger position for over 4 hours. They fired over 3,000 rounds. When they were finally extracted, the street below was carpeted with bodies. At one point, a Delta team leader made a decision that exemplified everything about American Special Operations methodology. His element was pinned down, taking casualties, unable to move. Standard procedure would have been to call for fire support and wait. He attacked instead. "We were getting picked apart staying still," he later explained. "So I told my guys we were going to assault through the ambush. They looked at me like I was crazy, but they followed. We killed about 20 Somalis in maybe 30 seconds. The rest ran. We were able to move after that." This was the Delta approach, the approach the British had called undisciplined, reckless, cowboy tactics. In the chaos of Mogadishu, it saved lives. The performance was extraordinary. Operators who had trained for surgical raids adapted to urban warfare against enemies who outnumbered them 100 to 1. Small teams maneuvered through enemy-held territory, evacuating wounded, recovering bodies, maintaining unit cohesion in chaos that would have shattered conventional forces. The cost was terrible. 19 Americans killed, over 80 wounded. But the Somalis paid a far higher price. Estimates of Somali casualties ranged from 500 to over 1,000 killed. The militia that had expected to overwhelm isolated American positions had instead been bled white by operators who refused to be destroyed. An SAS liaison officer who monitored the operation from the Joint Operations Center sent an assessment that completed the transformation in British thinking. Delta Force operators demonstrated extraordinary performance under conditions that would have challenged any special operations unit in the world. Their ability to adapt from planned operation to survival situation while maintaining offensive capability reflects training and leadership of the highest order. The aggressive methodology that we once criticized as undisciplined proved essential in this environment. Speed and violence of action, which we considered American weaknesses, enabled Delta personnel to achieve tactical results that patient methods could not have accomplished. We must acknowledge that the Americans have developed capabilities that equal and, in some respects, exceed our own. The student has become the peer. The student has become the peer. From undisciplined cowboys to peers, the transformation was complete. But the rivalry did not end. It evolved into something more productive, a partnership between equals who had learned to respect each other's strengths. In the decades following Mogadishu, Delta Force and the SAS worked together in ways that neither organization would have contemplated in 1979. Joint training became routine. Operators exchanged between units for years at a time. Tactics developed by one organization were adopted and adapted by the other. The British learned from American aggression. Their methods evolved to incorporate speed and violence when circumstances required. The careful, patient approach remained foundational. But it was no longer the only approach. SAS teams began training what they called deliberate action, American-style assaults that prioritized overwhelming force over careful infiltration. The Americans learned from British patience. Delta's initial overwhelming aggression was tempered by understanding of when to wait, when to observe, when to let situations develop. The action-oriented culture remained, but it was balanced by appreciation for the moments when action was wrong. The synthesis produced something stronger than either approach alone. Iraq and Afghanistan provided the proving ground for this integration. British and American special operators worked together night after night, conducting raids against terrorist cells, rescuing hostages, eliminating high-value targets. The tempo was brutal, sometimes multiple operations per night, week after week, month after month. Documents from these joint operations reveal how deeply the integration had progressed. British and American operators worked together so seamlessly that external observers could not distinguish between them. Techniques that had once been distinctly American or distinctly British became shared heritage. A joint operation in Iraq, in 2006, illustrated the synthesis perfectly. Intelligence identified a hostage location, a Western journalist held by al-Qaeda, in a fortified compound outside Baghdad. The rescue required both approaches: American speed for the assault, British patience for the intelligence gathering and surveillance that made the assault possible. SAS operators spent 72 hours observing the compound, mapping guard positions, identifying the room where the hostage was held. They moved at their traditional pace, slow, invisible, gathering information that would make the rescue possible. Then Delta hit the compound in 90 seconds. The assault team breached 3 walls simultaneously. They cleared 12 rooms in under a minute. They killed 6 guards and captured 4 others. The hostage was recovered without injury. The SAS commander who had led the surveillance phase described the operation as the best of both worlds. We could not have done the assault that quickly. The Americans could not have gathered the intelligence that precisely. Together, we achieved something neither could have achieved alone. Together, we achieved something neither could have achieved alone. This was the legacy of the rivalry, not continued competition, but a partnership that made both forces stronger. An American operator who served multiple tours with SAS attachment described the evolution. When I first trained with the Brits, they thought we were cowboys. We thought they were too slow. We were both wrong. They taught us patience. We taught them aggression. What we have now is better than what either of us started with. The rivalry that had begun with contempt had become a partnership that produced the most effective special operations capability in history. But the story has another dimension that tactical analysis tends to overlook. The transformation of Delta Force from dismissed amateurs to respected equals came at costs that no after-action report could capture. The men who proved the British wrong did not do so without scars. The operators who fought through Mogadishu carried memories that decades could not erase. The 18 hours of combat, the friends who died, the impossible choices made under fire, these experiences marked everyone who survived. The cowboy aggression that made Delta effective was not something that could be switched off when missions ended. Operators who had trained themselves to respond to threats with immediate, overwhelming violence found that response patterns did not disappear in peaceful environments. Relationships suffered. Marriages ended. Some operators struggled with the transition to civilian life in ways that surprised men who had always considered themselves unbreakable. The speed and violence that won battles created psychological patterns that were difficult to unlearn. The hypervigilance that kept operators alive in hostile environments became exhausting when there was no hostile environment. The willingness to act, immediately and without hesitation, created difficulties in a civilian world that expected deliberation and patience. Charlie Beckwith, who had started it all, died in 1994, just months after Mogadishu proved everything he had believed about American special operations capability. He never saw the full vindication of his vision, but he knew it was coming. His cowboys had become the standard by which special operations forces were measured worldwide. The British assessment that had called Delta Force undisciplined had been proven wrong in every way that mattered. but the proof had required sacrifice that those assessments never anticipated. The operators who served in Delta during its evolution from dismissed experiment to elite force paid prices that cannot be measured in after-action reports. They gave years of their lives to training that pushed human limits. They risked death in operations that the world would never know about. They carried burdens that no medal or commendation could acknowledge. Some gave more than years. The 19 Americans who died in Mogadishu, the 8 who died at Desert One, the operators who fell in classified missions that have never been acknowledged, they paid the ultimate price to prove that American special operations could match or exceed any force in the world. The SAS assessment of 1,979 had called them undisciplined cowboys. By 1994, those same analysts were studying Delta methods for lessons they could apply to their own training. The transformation was complete. The proof was written in blood and fire across 3 continents. But the rivalry never fully ended. Even today, British and American special operators maintain the competitive tension that has defined their relationship since Beckwith first proposed creating an American SAS. They train together, deploy together, and trust each other with their lives. But when operations are compared, when tactics are debated, when one unit does something the other considers wrong, the old arguments resurface. The British still think Americans are too aggressive. The Americans still think the British are too slow. Both are probably right. Both are probably wrong. The truth is that the two approaches complement each other in ways that neither fully acknowledges. The patience that the SAS prizes and the aggression that Delta celebrates are both necessary tools. The masters are the operators who know when to apply each. Colonel Charlie Beckwith died believing he had created something that would outlast him. He was right. Delta Force today bears little resemblance to the unit he built in 1977. The equipment has evolved beyond recognition. The tactics have been refined through decades of combat. The operators are selected and trained using methods that make the original programs look primitive. But the spirit remains, the willingness to do what needs to be done, regardless of doctrine, regardless of criticism, regardless of what allies or enemies think. The American approach to special operations, aggressive, adaptive, unafraid of action. The British called it undisciplined. They called Delta operators cowboys. They were wrong about undisciplined. They were right about cowboys. Because cowboys get the job done. Desert One to Mogadishu, Panama, to Iraq, to Afghanistan. Through every evolution, every failure, every success, Delta Force proved that American aggression, properly channeled, could achieve what patient methods could not. The SAS taught them the foundation. Delta built something new on that foundation, and what they built has shaped special operations worldwide. Undisciplined cowboys. That was the assessment. That was what the most elite special operations force in the world thought of America's attempt to match them. 20 years later, those same assessors were adopting American methods, studying American operations, acknowledging that the students had become masters. The cowboys had proven everyone wrong, and they had done it the American way, loud, fast, and absolutely effective.